Global equity markets hit new highs as confidence grows about avoiding a global recession. A civil war looms in the car industry, and the cost of not having women in the workforce. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Monday, the 11th of March, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, after the show, you have an interview coming up. And I know I say every interview is an interesting interview, but this one is ultra interesting.
This time I'm not lying. It really is interesting.
It is genuinely interesting. And I say that about all of them, but this one, you're speaking to Guy Keller, who is the portfolio manager for the Tribeca Nuclear Energy Opportunities Strategy. This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so they have a wholesale fund that invests in nuclear opportunities. Now, that might be uranium, but it might be other parts of the process. Given that the Libs are floating the idea of these small nuclear power plants and Labor is dead set against them, we thought we should actually find out about nuclear power, how it works, how these smaller plants work, how safe they are. And it was a great chat with Guy. He goes through all that sort of thing and answers all the sort of difficult to answer questions, to be honest, and was very frank about what he thinks of the industry.
Yeah, and then explains it all as well, the relevance to investors as well, which I thought was just he covered it all. It is a must-listen conversation. It's coming up after the show. The main story this morning, though, Sean, the S&P ASX 200 hit a record high on Friday, with global equity markets trading at or close to record levels on the back of growing hopes that there won't be a global recession.
Yes, 2024 has started with a bang when it comes to equities, much better than most pundits thought on January 1. Starting here in Australia, the S&P ASX 200 closed up 1.1% on Friday to finish at a new record of 7,847 points. It's been the financials and property companies that have done best over the past week or so, and that's in response to hopes that rates will start falling later this year. We talked a bit about the banks last week. We now have Commonwealth Bank at another record high. It was up nearly 2% on Friday. National Australia Bank, Westpac and ANZ are all at multi-year highs. When that happens, the local market is going to do pretty well. The weak economic growth announcement last week, the economy expanded by just 0.2% last quarter, had the kind of unusual effect of helping share markets because it improves the chance of a rate cut. The confidence here and overseas reflects the growing belief, which has been kind of supported by central banks in the US, Europe and Australia over the past week or so, that the globe probably won't fall into a recession. No guarantees on that, but it just seems to be that's where we're landing. Now, recessions mean earnings will grow. That's good for markets. So in this case, the ASX 200 is at a record high.
Okay, so what about outside Australia then in terms of markets?
Well, the US and Eurozone shares hit new record highs last week, notwithstanding Wall Street came off a touch over the weekend. You have to mention Nvidia, it's everyone's favourite stock. It hit a new high over the weekend and then it dropped. And by the end of the session, it was down about 5.5%. That's about $200 billion worth of value for the day that it lost. Anyway, Japan's bourse is also trading at a record level, recently beating its previous peak of 35 years ago. The FTSE 100 in London actually peaked about a year ago, but it isn't trading far off those levels now. The Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong is the odd market out, reflecting weakness in China. Now, all this good news comes with a big caveat, as they always do when we're talking about markets and the economy. The global economy isn't out of the woods yet. Inflation is falling, but it's not where central banks want it just yet. And that last mile, that last percentage point or so, is looking very tricky to get. Unemployment is rising, not a bad thing given the very low unemployment levels previously. But this so-called soft landing may actually be a reality in coming quarters. It's kind of like the Goldilocks outcome. If you have to have a slowdown, you don't want a recession, you just want a slowdown. And that seems to be what share market investors think. And that's why we're seeing the markets fly.
And what's happening in the world of markets outside of equities?
Well, most of the news in those markets reflects what's happening on interest rates. The US rate cuts don't help the US dollar. That's pushed the Aussie dollar back above 66 US cents. It's trading at its highest level in 7 weeks. Bitcoin is trading above 69,000 US dollars a unit, extending recent gains. Gold is trading around record levels, not far off 2,200 US dollars an ounce. It's never been there before. It closed over the weekend at a new high, and Brent crude fell a bit over the weekend to under 82 US dollars a barrel.
And of course, on Monday's international markets, brought to you by Blue Chip Communication, the experts helping financial services companies market, communicate, and grow. Visit bluechipcommunication.com.au. Sean, we've got plenty to get to, including this story about the civil war that is looming in the automotive industry. I think this is absolutely fascinating, and we'll be back in a moment with that and the rest of the day's business news. Sean, the value of industrial property in Australia has grown rapidly over the past 3 years and is now in line with the office sector, according to a new report.
For many years, industrial space was a poor cousin to commercial office and retail space, but then along came online shopping and then COVID, which accelerated the need for companies to have big warehouses to do all the logistics and send out goods, and then came data centres and cloud computing and now AI. Nowadays, the office sector is the poor cousin to the industrial sector. Higher rents and new developments over the past 3 years has pushed the value of industrial property in Australia to almost $300 billion, which is about the value of the office property sector, according to CBRE and reported in the Financial Review. Of course, the value of the office sector has tumbled. It's down around 15 to 20% in Australia, and the prognosis for that sector ain't great, whereas industrial is set to continue. CBRE says the combined value of warehouse facilities in the capital cities across the country is $293 billion. The combined value of office space is $295 billion. Then retail comes in at $267 billion. But most pundits are pretty confident that industrial in 12 months, 2 years will be well ahead of both office and retail.
Australia's Trade Minister Don Farrell says the dispute with China over wine tariffs will soon come to an end, and he expects Beijing will complete its internal reviews by the end of this month.
Senator Farrell said he had built up a strong relationship with his Chinese counterpart, and he expects it to lead to the repeal of trade tariffs on wine and lobsters. Speaking on Sky News yesterday, he said he's hopeful that China will lift all of its tariffs on Australian wine, but if they don't, Canberra will continue with its World Trade Organization dispute. Senator Farrell said he had also been given an understanding from Chinese authorities that they're looking to trade barriers on lobster exports.
We've talked about Don Farrell, Sean, in the past, and the fact that he has built very good relationships, as he says, with his Chinese counterpart, and the fact that because he has or had a winery as well, didn't he? And he's kind of been really kind of passionate about trying to restore these relationships.
Yeah, and in fact, he asked his counterpart to come and visit him on his winery, and he said, yeah, he would. I don't know that that's actually happened, but it's great. I mean, diplomacy is fraught at the best of times, but I think if you have two players who actually get on with each other, it's a great start anyway.
Where do you schmooze someone with lobster, though? Like, I mean, you take someone to a winery for wine. Do you take them like scuba diving in a rock pool? I don't know. I actually don't really know much about where lobsters are found. There was another good weekend for auction results, with the combined capital city preliminary rate coming in at 72.8%, which is higher than a week earlier.
The increase came from smaller capital cities, with Sydney's clearance rate actually falling slightly to 76.2% and Melbourne's rate dropping to 66.2%, which was about 4 percentage points or so. Of course, it's Labor Day today in Victoria, so that probably hurt auction clearance rates. The trend in housing values, according to CoreLogic, has held up reasonably well, with each of the major capitals recording a rise in value as we approach the middle of the month, based on the rolling 4-week change. So this is over the past 4 weeks or so. Dwelling values are up about 0.6% across the country. Sydney and Melbourne are up 0.5% and 0.2% respectively. Perth's at 1.8%, Adelaide 1.1%. This is over the past 4 weeks. Brisbane's lost some steam, though it's still at 0.8%, still pretty strong.
There's a civil war, Sean, I've mentioned this a few times, looming in the auto industry, with upmarket electric vehicle brand Polestar joining Tesla in resigning from the national motoring body in protest over its stance on the government's proposed national emission standards. However, yesterday, Energy Minister Chris Bowen hinted that some of the standards might be changed.
Starting with Polestar, it said it was not prepared to continue as a member of the lobby group. That's the Federated Chamber of Automotive Industries, which it claims has been campaigning to erode trust in the government scheme and slow down the automotive industry's approach to reducing carbon emissions. Obviously, this is an EV company like Tesla, so it's all for reducing carbon emissions. As the new standards are currently proposed, they'll cap emissions of a car manufacturer's fleet of vehicles. It will apply to new cars only and are designed to reduce emissions by 60% by 2030. Now, Polestar sold about 2,500 vehicles in Australia last year. There's about 4,000 of them on the road. It says with transport emissions forecast to be Australia's largest source of emissions by 2030, Australia has a clear role to play and must catch up with the rest of the developed world. We now have Tesla and Polestar, the EV, the two main EV players outside BYD, pitted against the internal combustion engine teams, and the Federated Chamber of Automotive Industries really is at odds with itself, particularly because Tesla is a board member of that group. Now, further complicating things, the government has been under fire over these standards, and yesterday Energy Minister Chris Bowen conceded the new standards were being introduced faster than in other countries, and he kind of opened the way for change. He said the government's prepared to accept changes if they're proposed by the industry. He wants the industry to agree that there needs to be a new framework to get emissions down, and he wants the industry to be genuine in their efforts for that framework to work. But it kind of opened the way yesterday that I suspect means there will be changes. That may not necessarily, though, help Polestar and Tesla, who, of course, it's in their interest to push these new emission standards because it's obviously going to mean more sales for them.
Indeed. Now, AMP Deputy Chief Economist Diana Messina, who's one of our kind of semi-regular, one of our favourite economists here on the show, she's provided an economist look at women in the workforce and the opportunity cost of having fewer women in jobs.
Yes, it was done for International Women's Day on Friday. Fascinating. Starting with the female participation rate in the workforce, it's 62.6%, way below the male rate of 71.1%. Mind you, 62.6 is better than the 43% it was in the late 70s. More women work part-time, and there's greater underemployment of females, meaning women want to work more hours. The main reason for women not being able to work is caring for kids, followed by health conditions or a disability, and returning to study. But childcare is easily the dominant reason why they don't work. Interestingly, cost of childcare is only the fifth main reason within that category. The main reason women nominate childcare is they prefer to be looking after their kids themselves. The gender pay gap is real based on OECD figures, but Australia at 9.9% is actually doing better than the global average of 11.6%. The solution, Ms. Messina recommends three things as starters. Improve financial literacy starting in primary schools. Notwithstanding recent changes, the government needs to do more around childcare. That's the second thing. And third, society needs to be better at accepting men taking time off work to look after their family, while girls should be taught how high school subject choices play a role in future employment.
All right, one last one before we get to international news. More than 43,000 kids across the country are being homeschooled. That's twice as many as before the pandemic.
It's an incredible increase, and some of the biggest winners are the tutoring companies across the nation. The Australian Tutoring Association's latest survey of 120 members reveals parents are paying somewhere between $50 and $110 an hour for these one-on-one lessons, according to a story in The Australian. 40% of parents use tutoring purely for remedial lessons. That means 60% don't. And 9.2% pinned the reason on poor teaching at schools. 1/3 of tutors reported a rise in homeschooling, and nearly half had seen an increase in school avoidance over the past couple of years. 4 out of 10 students had been tutored for more than 2 years.
Okay, turning to international news now. Joe Biden has accused Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of, quote, hurting Israel through his administration's treatment of Palestinians, but added that the US would not set a red line limiting his actions against Hamas.
He's kind of having a bit both ways in this one, Joe Biden. The US president also said in an interview with MSNBC, reported in the Financial Review, that he would not give up on the possibility of a ceasefire ahead of Ramadan, which actually begins tonight. Mr. Biden said the Israeli Prime Minister had the right to defend Israel and a right to continue to pursue Hamas, but he must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost. He said, and I quote, "In my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel." Easily the strongest words coming from the president on Benjamin Netanyahu since the beginning of the conflict.
And Ireland held a referendum over the weekend on proposals to replace constitutional references to the makeup of a family and around a mother's, quote, duties in the home.
Yeah, so it was held on Friday in conjunction with International Women's Day. The Prime Minister of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, was pushing it, and both were soundly defeated. In fact, it was the highest ever no vote percentage in an Irish referendum. Now, the Prime Minister had pitched the vote as a chance to delete some very old-fashioned, very sexist language about women. A proposal to expand the definition of family from a relationship founded on marriage to include other durable relationships was rejected 68% to 32%. Ouch. A second referendum on a proposal to replace language surrounding a woman's duties in the home with a clause recognising the role of family members in the provision of care was rejected 74% to 26%. Double ouch. Following the vote, the Prime Minister said voters had given his government 2 wallops. Indeed, they did.
That's an incredible story.
I know. It's just amazing that so many people don't want to change the language, which is obviously sexist language. Well, sorry, perceived sexist language.
Yeah. Seems very outdated. Sean, I have an answer to a question that nobody asked.
Good.
A question
good.
I asked.
Share both the question and the answer. And that
Well, it's a question that I asked myself before about lobsters and how not being 100% sure on how lobsters were what I was trying to get at was I don't actually know where lobsters are caught or grown, etc., within Australia because I don't know much about the lobster industry in Australia. But I kind of found out that there's while you've been talking, I've been doing a bit of research into lobsters in Australia and our lobster industry. And there's kind of a few different ways, like there's the small scale kind of lobster pots, and really that's really quite recreational. There's the larger scale commercial. There's either commercial diving or there's commercial fishing for lobsters, essentially using trawling. And then there's even essentially farming of lobsters where they are kind of grown out in land-based nurseries kind of thing. And
oh wow,
it's quite incredible. Anyway, I've learned a lot and I wanted to share that just so we ended on a note that made me sound a little bit more intelligent than I made myself sound earlier.
Excellent. Very interesting.
Yeah, wanted to share. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You're speaking today with Guy Keller, the portfolio manager for the Tribeca Nuclear Energy Opportunity Strategy. Sean, if you haven't learnt enough already about lobsters with me, go and listen to Guy talking about nuclear energy.
Yep, gives us a background on the nuclear energy industry in Australia, actually not just in Australia, globally, how to invest in it, things like from safety of it to the different components of it to how these small nuclear power plants might work. Guy knows all about it, and if you're an investor particularly, it's interesting, but it's way beyond that. It's more just an understanding of that sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And considering there's so much discussion about this at the moment, It's actually a really handy 101 so that you can kind of take part in this conversation with a kind of a sound knowledge base. And also check out after that, Fear and Greed the Week Ahead with Stephen Koukoulas.
Yes, or not a big week for the economy, but obviously last week we had the economic growth numbers. I asked him when he thinks interest rates are going to be cut. He gives me an answer on that one. National Australia Bank business confidence up this week. Westpac consumer sentiment surveys up. So always a good chat with Stephen on a Monday morning.
Yeah, certainly is. There's a couple of good things coming up in the Fear and Greed playlist. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 11th of March, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.